Hey, Andrew Masters here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have a very special episode. I am joined by the great Butch Vig. Butch, thank you so much for joining me.
Andrew, I'm excited to be here. What are we going to check out today?
Let's just jump in
Let's
and we'll
do
check it out.
I'm ready.
So, welcome. This is the Barefoot Sound Experience in West Hollywood.
Wow, lots of Barefoot speakers. I can tell. I use them all the time, so I'm in a familiar territory here.
This control room has been a studio for a pretty long time, and our friends at Barefoot took it over, and I think they took apart some of the treatment and re-outfitted it for this crazy 7.14 Atmos setup. I know you've been working in studios for a very, very long time, and I'm sure those setups have evolved quite dramatically over time. And have you had the opportunity to listen to much Atmos mixes or anything like that?
I have. In fact, we just finished mixing a new garbage album that is in regular stereo and also in Spatial and Dolby Surround. I've been diving into it more over the last like 5 or 6 years. Okay. And I know it's a very specific thing in terms of how you set up a room or how you monitor in headphones. Yeah. And it looks, just from how I can see here, that you've got it set up correctly. But as you know, you've got to get the experts to come in and fine tune that room, right? I don't know who they worked with here, but that's a whole art and science unto itself, right?
All my favorite speakers in here, they have the LCR 27s with the 26, and then I think everything else is the footprint ones. This is actually what I started on from Barefoot. I heard these and immediately it was like, what's going on? Where's the sub? Why does this sound so good? I had a much more involved setup and wound up switching to these. So this was like my conversion to Barefoot.
I started out on the MM27s. Oh yeah. And I have 3 pair.
Nice.
Because I have a pair at my home studio. I have a pair in a road case that I started lugging around when I was doing like sessions on tour on the road. I used them when I did the Foo Fighters documentary, Sonic Highways. We did all of different recordings in different cities. And I have another 3rd pair at my engineer Billy Bush's studio in Atwater, Red Razor. And then we have the 01s, and then I just got a new pair of the Footprint 03s, and they sound fantastic. I'm totally thrilled to have them.
That's amazing. Yeah, I just got the 27s. It was the same story. I went into a bigger, nicer room with 27s. It was like, shit, I gotta get these things. They're so good.
It's funny because I work at my home studio and there's not really any insulation. So if someone's recording vocals or something in the room next to it, I have to be pretty quiet. So I have a smaller pair, not NS10s, but really small pair, almost like headphones, or I'll put headphones on because I don't want any bleed to go into the microphone. So we'll record that on playback. I flip to the MM27s and people are always like, holy shit, this sounds friggin' amazing. Yeah. I gotta ask, you said you have a home studio setup. What's that look like in your space? Well, it doesn't look this fancy. There's not really any proper acoustic engineering or anything. It's a bedroom downstairs. Actually, the couch pulls out to a bed if we have guests staying over there. I have a Pro Tools rig, and it's just a desk with basically just using the DAW. I don't have a mixed console anymore. I love consoles, but I didn't have any room for it. And I've got acoustic drums, electric drums. I use Roland TD50X. Their new system is fantastic. And mics and guitars, and there's a piano, and I've got a lot of synths. But it's a bedroom studio. Yeah. And I still trust the Barefoots because I use them all the time. I've been using them for 15 years.
Oh, wow.
That's my go-to speaker, just because I swear I can hear a half dB move on anything in the mid-range, whether you're bringing a guitar or vocal up or down, or even slight EQs in the drums. And I think it's just very accurate in the detail that I'm hearing. So that's why I love them so much.
I love hearing when like people who I've grown up listening to their music also just work in sort of whatever it takes to make it happen. That's really cool.
Yeah, I started out on a 4-track in my partner Steve Marker. Before we started Smart Studios, we had a 4-track in his basement, and we just bought all our gear at like thrift shops. You know, we'd say, oh, there's a couple Radio Shack mics for $10. We'd buy them, and usually they sounded like shit. Yeah. But it was always very DIY. I never went to a recording school. I never apprenticed through a proper studio. A lot of, that sort of used to be the old system. You would work your way up from the assistant to the T-boy to the tape engineer and second engineer and then first engineer. Maybe you became a producer. I just started doing it from day one and I didn't know what I was doing. So I feel like I'm still learning in some ways, which is why I love coming to studios and I love watching music documentaries, and I still read Tape Op and every other nerdy music magazine out there because, like I said, I think I'm still learning something every day.
Well, it's pretty amazing to see how some of these studios now are wired up and set up and utilize digital, like in the box and these controllers and things like that. I think it's super cool because, I came up at East West on the big consoles and stuff.
And I love East West. Yep. The rooms there are incredible.
Some of the automation's a little older and a little, you gotta fight it sometimes.
The flying faders. Yeah, been there.
So I love sort of the marriage of like vintage, 1073s, you've got the tube tag 1176, cool hardware that you can track through. So you can obviously do overdubs when mixing, sometimes.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to. You go, that vocal's not quite right, or we need to add a extra harmony or whatever, and you just do it on the fly. It happens all the time.
Being able to have some of the modern mixing automation capabilities in the session and then still have some like cool vintage color that you can go to if you need to is so cool.
I mean, that's the great thing about recording these days, in the 21st century, the technology is so incredible and it's gotten really good and a lot of it has become very affordable. So almost anybody now can figure out how to make a pretty good recording in their bedroom at home, That didn't happen 20 or 25 years ago. I think a lot of purists who really dive into recording still love analog gear, microphones, compressors, Pultec equalizers. Some people still love using tape machines. I have a 2-track that we still sometimes print mixes to. I haven't used a 24-track for a while, but I still love the sound of tape as well as digital.
Those old recall sheets
The old recall sheets were a pain in the butt. I got really good, Andrew. When I first learned how to do recalls, the assistant would make every single piece of gear on a big sheet. Mm-hmm. Like, here's the Pultec, here's the LA2A, and here's the channel 1, here's channel 2, and you could have like 100 sheets you'd have to go through to do a proper recall. I used to do it all on one piece of paper, and I wrote super tiny.
Oh my God.
I write channel 1, and I had like 6K plus 2, 500 minus 3. I'd write all the EQs, inserts for compressors, reverb sends, and I could do a whole song on one sheet. Nobody could figure out how to do the recall except for me.
Yeah.
Because I think there was some strange, my writing were just little things that I had that only I understood. But I just didn't want to print out 100 pages and then sort through them all to do a recall. So it worked for me.
I had cameras on my phone then, luckily. So all of the photos from my whole tenure there are just recall photos that I just drop into albums or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could do it on your phone now. I know that people used to do that with video cameras. When we'd finish a session, some of the other engineers would take like a VCR or a VHS camera and just go over the board and talk. Okay, we're using this. Here's the insert on the bass guitar, and they'd go through the whole console, and then stick it, label it, and you'd put the VHS tape up in the closet, and hopefully you didn't have to pull it out. But it worked,
Yeah, and hopefully you didn't miss anything.
Well, as you said, that's the great thing about digital. Whatever you worked on the day before, you open up the session and it's exactly where you left off, which is pretty great.
Are you doing a lot of mixing on the projects you're doing now?
Yes, and I mix pretty much in the box, either at my studio at Grunge is Dead in Silver Lake in LA here.
Oh, cool.
Or our engineer Billy has a more of a proper mix room in Atwater called Red Razor, and we do a lot of mixing there. We finished all the garbage mixes there recently.
I had the luxury of coming in yesterday and just pulling up a bunch of records that have been mixed in Atmos and just plowing through them, and it sounded really great. So I thought, you want to sit down and listen to some
Of course, that's
stuff?
why we're here, man.
Yeah.
I want to hear some music.
Heck yeah, let's do it.
Let's take a listen, shall we?
There you go.
First things first, when you're monitoring in this Atmos thing, it's a little more complicated jumping around. I know you've experienced it a little bit, but for the everyday person watching this, we have this software called Dadman. It's the equivalent of if you have an interface and you have a little monitor controller, but this is a little more complex. So we're gonna listen to a track through this that has the Dolby renderer first, and this is just like a really cool track that's just got a lot of stuff going on. So we'll start there, and then we'll flip over to like Apple Spatial playlist and hear some other mixes and just kind of get a
totally
feel
cool
for the sound.
Yeah, totally cool. The spatial separation is incredible. I love seeing the movement when you're watching the where the music is being panned between the speakers.
So this was a track, from my understanding, that was very much produced for, you know, this type of listening environment.
Which it sounds like.
Yeah. And that's kind of a new development because the format, you know, is now becoming more popular in music. It's also very popular in film and games. But now it's something that can be considered at the start of a project of like, okay, well now we have a whole 3D landscape to consider the production rather than just
stereo speakers.
Right.
Yeah. You know, we obviously when you start out, you're just mixing in stereo, and then for a while there was quad back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And Dolby 7.1 has been around for a while, but consumers now listen to spatial and surround mixes all the time. And so most of the engineers and producers that I know are thinking that in the back of their head when they start a project.
Yep.
I know we just finished mixing the Garbage record, and the whole process, Billy Bush, the engineer, and I have been sort of thinking about how these songs are going to translate from the stereo mixes to the spatial mixes. And it's kind of exciting because I think when you do that, some of the production decisions you make in terms of arrangements, you're actually thinking in terms of how you want to put it into that environment. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask, when I go into another room, you know, I do a lot of these tours, and I like to listen to the people's space, and even when you're just doing sessions, you got to kind of get familiar with the room. Do you have any like go-to records, or do you just kind of jump into the room and start going? What's your process?
Oh man, I know what you're saying exactly, especially if you're in a studio on day one and you're not sure what the monitors are like or what the room has been tuned like, what the bottom end is like. I usually, if it's a rock record, I'll put on something that I have worked on in the past, like Smashing Pumpkins, or it might be the Foo Fighters or Green Day, just because I know those records intimately, and then I can tell, oh, there's not enough bass in here, or there is too much bass if I'm standing in the back of the room. If it's a pop record or something more electronic, then I'll make a different choice. But I usually want to put something on that I'm very familiar with, because then I can make better judgments. And if I'm going somewhere and I don't know the sound of the room, a lot of the times I take one of my pairs of Barefoot MM27s. I have them in a row case. I started taking them on tour with me with the Foo Fighters back in the day. And because I trust those speakers.
Yeah.
And I'd rather just ship those and then put them up, because that's probably half the battle in terms of figuring out the control room.
Do you stream them? Do you still bring CDs around or anything like that?
Not really.
Yeah.
Probably should, because, you know, in theory, a 44.1 16 CD is going to sound better than a 320 megabits streamer, JPEG or whatever. And the thing is, I have a tendency, like everybody, to listen to the streaming services because that's how music is being consumed.
Yep.
You know, so even when we're mixing the latest Garbage record or anything I work on, I listen to it on my phone, and then I go in the car and stream it in my car.
Yep.
And I want to hear how all those conversion rates and the digital compression, how that is affecting the sound of the space and the drums and where the vocals sit, you know. And I think it's important for producers and engineers to know how it's going to sound, how the consumer's going to hear it. And now everybody's listening with earbuds.
Yep.
And that sort of sometimes can sometimes make you change the mix process in terms of EQ and stereo placement and things like that. So
yeah, definitely. I love your story of how you got into recording and came up the traditional way of just figuring it out. What are some of the things that you've picked up about studio workflow and running sessions that have kind of, you've learned like, okay, this is gonna make the process much easier for the artist?
Well, I started out very DIY. I didn't go through a recording school. I didn't get to apprentice at a studio where you worked your way up through the food chain. And when we bought an 8-track and opened up Smart Studios, most of the bands we brought in didn't have a clue what they were doing either. And they said, "You're the producer, right?" I go, "Yeah." I wasn't even sure what a producer did at the time, other than to have an opinion and try to just keep it moving forward.
Yeah.
So I've learned to don't have to be too precious or purist about a studio. I'm totally, sometimes even now, seat in my pants, whatever we have will work. Is there a microphone on over there? I want to record this guitar right now. Just move it over by the amp. You know, I don't want to take a half an hour and set up 3 microphones and balance them all out. It's like I just want to get the part recorded.
Yeah.
Especially since these days records can be, they can sound like a Steely Dan record, be incredibly beautiful and perfect sound, and they can be super lo-fi and grungy or dirty and distorted, and they can be both of those in the same song. And people who listen to music expect any kind of production these days, and there are no rules. So I try to just remind myself all the time, like, hey, we can just go on the fly and just wing it. You know, it's going to be fine.
So whatever generally makes getting the thing as simple as easy as possible.
And as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
You know, I used to spend a day on a drum sound, you know, on the snare drum sometimes. I don't like to do that anymore.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
I'll spend 10 minutes on a snare drum, that's about it. And then go, that's good enough, let's go.
Yeah.
I think there's an aesthetic that people realize in the studio, and producers and engineers, performance is still the king, you know.
Yeah.
As much as I can obsess over the snare sound or a guitar tone or whatever, at the end of the day, people are listening to the feel of a song or the hook of a song or the groove or what the singer is trying to emote, and is so important. Performance is what makes a song.
Yeah.
And so I try not to get too hung up on the technical things recording. If you heard some of the latest garbage stuff, the tracking right before we started mixing is pretty rough in spots.
Oh, yeah?
Because we just sort of record and don't care about getting too perfect. By the time it's mixed, I tidy it up a lot, and you know, we're doing, Billy and Butch and I are doing a lot of things to the mix to hype it up or to, you know, exaggerate dynamics or whatever. But in the recording process, I think it's important just to capture it as quickly as you can and as easily as you can.
That's great. Great advice. Now we've listened through the Dad Man. We're gonna switch over and listen to a couple familiar songs in Apple Spatial. So
come on, we got to go with Du Hast.
Okay.
You've got to go with some Rammstein, right?
All right.
You got to admit that sounds pretty damn killer.
Yeah, absolutely. The stuff with the synths and electronics, I think that is really cool. And it's also great because there's rock guitars and drums and stuff.
And that's one of the things we were talking about earlier. I think it's important that a lot of the rock spatial mixes still have that sort of punch in your face power, and the drums and the guitars are still kind of right in your face, but all the atmospherics are swirling around in the keyboards and the synths, and it sounds really cool. That's a really good mix for this format.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that we've listened to this, first off, this room sounds incredible. For anyone who's curious about the gear, they're using an Avid Pro Tools Matrix studio interface connected to the whole rig. Barefoot's everywhere. A really tight listening room, so mixing in here would be super fun, especially like we were talking before, the controller thing. I get in my head about staring at Pro Tools with the visual cue of writing, so I love kind of just grabbing a fader and closing my eyes.
Yeah, riding the fader, just let it do its thing. And tactile feel.
Another thing I wanted to ask you was, when you were coming up through Smart and learning on the go, what was the transition into doing more mixing for you?
Well, most of the bands didn't really have a clue what was going on, and we started out to 8-track and would just mix to stereo, and all those early records I had to do in 2 or 3 days. Like, we would track everything in a day, do all overdubs, vocals and lead guitar, percussion, whatever on day 2, and then mix everything on day 3. And I did like literally hundreds of records like that. It's just so fast.
Yeah.
So I didn't really have the opportunity to experiment a lot in the studio early on. I used to have, like when we'd track, we had a board set up, and the drummer would set up and play his drums for 5 minutes. It sounded like shit. I would just insert all the EQ. Sounds great. We're ready to go. And to a certain extent, I had a mix template.
Okay.
So once I got in the mix zone, I sort of knew how I wanted to set the board, what delays and reverbs I wanted to have, compression, any upward EQ, whatever. And I would work a lot on the first song, and once I had that, I was able to move pretty quickly from that point on to do 12 songs in a day.
Yeah.
You know.
Smart.
Had to. I mean, it was Smart Studios. We didn't have any choice. We had to get it done in a day. The first record that I really had time to experiment was Gish with Smashing Pumpkins. I think we had 36 days to record and mix the record. And to me, that was like making a Steely Dan album, you know, because we could spend a day getting the drum sound. And we spent a lot of time in overdubs and getting Billy's vocals and everything to sound great. But then also the mixing process, I think there were maybe, 11 or 12 songs in the record. We probably mixed for about 8 or 9 days, you know. It was maybe we get 3 songs done in 2 days, but I appreciated the fact that Billy wanted to really get it right, and that was the first time I ever really was able to dive in to a mix, and I like that. You know, I like being able to finesse dynamics and you know, ear candy, what I call ear candy, little moments in songs where you hear these little things that maybe you don't hear the first time. As you hear on repeated listens, there's things in the song that start to become apparent, and it's fun to do that.
Yeah. I remember you talking about, you know, having limited tracks and having to bust some things down. Would you do that once everything was tracked, and that was mostly drums, right? You said you would leave four channels open.
When we had 8 tracks, yeah, we had to figure out, if I knew there were going to be a lot of overdubs, I would usually leave a couple tracks, like maybe 2 or 3 left. So I'd put the bass on track 4.
Yeah.
And then I would do stereo drums 5 and 6, and I had to get the mix right.
Yeah.
So you'd be playing and listen back to the first playback, kick drum needs to be louder or whatever, but that was it. You know, you could still EQ it or compress it and do rides on the stereo mix in the final version you were doing, but you had to commit.
Yeah.
But then I could do 3 tracks on 1, 2, and 3, and I could bounce those to 8, and I could do 3 tracks on 1, 2, 3 and bounce those to 7. Then I could go back and record over 1, 2, 3. Anyway, sometimes I did even more of that, kept bouncing around just because we kept filling up tracks. And then we bought a 16 track, and then we bought a 24 track, and eventually a 48 track studio, and then Pro Tools, you know, so where you can just record unlimited tracks, and which is great, but can be a blessing and a curse, you know, when you have unlimited tracks.
Yeah, some of those limitations and just even time limitations are really great for just moving forward and not lingering too long on any particular endless possibility of, well, let's try this because we have 500 tracks.
It's funny, Only Happy When It Rains on the first Garbage record was done on 24-track tape. And the drums on that are mono, the kick, snare, hat, and crash. I just did to a mono track.
That's cool.
All mixed down. From day one, I was sort of planning on going back and redoing the drums, but then we started filling up all these loops, like weird percussion loops and guitar feedback and stuff. And the song sort of became a track that was almost like doing a remix. And we didn't have 48 tracks at that point, so I couldn't slave another reel together and do it. So I mixed the whole thing just when my first initial drums I did in mono. That's how the record sounded. You know, we finished it when the mix happened.
I'm so grateful to have you here. This was really fun. Check out this amazing studio. You know, this is something that people can actually come in and book and use for Atmos, mixing, whatever. Here in West Hollywood. It's a beautiful place, Barefoot Sound Experience. Butch, thank you so much.
Andrew, thank you so much. This is great. I can tell the room sounds killer just from the music that we've heard. I love the Barefoots. I just love the detail and the mid-range that they give me. But the room sounds really good. I can tell it's been tuned, and it sounds pretty kick-ass in here.
Awesome.
I wish they could set this up in my house.
Yeah, well, you might be able to. It just depends on the room, you know, and how much patience
you know
you
what?
have.
It'd be easier for me to come here rather than try to set up in my house.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you to everyone who's watching this. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.